Network and the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George. I'm Michael Haldis. Welcome to calendar year 2026. We're going to continue with the theme that we've been dealing with all year, which is the mystery of salvation. And in the last few weeks, actually the last class we had was December 14th, but leading up to that, we've been talking a lot about freedom and free will because it's obviously so germane to how we understand how we attain salvation. So today, I'm actually calling the topic today salvation and the bondage of freedom. A little bit of a play on words on purpose to get our discussion going. But just as a reminder, leading up to this class, we had discussed previously the nature of our God-given free will. And we can go over stuff because I don't expect anybody to remember what we talked about 3-4 weeks ago. But we talked about that. We talked about the importance of cooperating, synergy, cooperating with the Holy Spirit in order to become who we're supposed to become in God's image and likeness. And then the paradoxical nature of autonomy in captivity. Remember, we discussed a lot of how we think we're being autonomous, but what we're really doing is creating or participating in conditions of our spiritual captivity, but not really being aware of it. We talked a lot about that. So today, we're going to kind of go further with those concepts, but we're going to really talk about the nature of freedom as it relates to salvation and why we confuse the capacity for freedom with freedom itself, and why this type of misunderstanding leads us into a spiritual bondage we may not even be aware of. So, and a lot of this is because, kind of germane to some of the things we were talking about earlier, the what and the how. So much of what we think of as the devil's deception, the things that hold it, are usually half lies or partial truths. So they're kind of hard to just, if you're not really engaged in the sacramental life of the church, they're kind of hard to understand or even recognize sometimes. That we can be going down a road in our thought and our actions that seems okay until we wake up and realize we've been kind of buying into things that aren't true. I mean, case in point, remember where the devil told Adam and Eve, "You're not going to die," right? It's true. Yeah, but they did. Spiritual death led to physical death. They created conditions. So let me just start off with a question, get the dialogue going. So, I said bondage or freedom. So when and how does our freedom become bondage? No trick questions here. This is just.
Well, I don't know whether this answers your question or the direction you want to go. I was thinking about, again, the kind of scriptures you talked about before, namely Ecclesiastes and also Paul, Romans 7 and 8. I think you could also talk about it. Well, in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, who has everything, okay, in contemporary terms, he'd probably be an NBA superstar now. He's got everything he wants in life. But then, but it doesn't satisfy him, okay? And he recognizes basically the bondage that cherishing things of this earth are imposing upon him. And he's able to achieve a freedom at the end because he's able to, in some ways, perhaps not renounce those things, but show a humility towards those things and embrace God, accept the gifts of life and all of the good things that God has given. He uses the term fear of God, although I think we mean it more in terms of accepting God's awesomeness.
Yeah.
Okay. Although to me, though, there's sort of something missing there that the Christian movement, and if you look at Paul 7 and 8, and also maybe 12, Paul talks about in 7.
You talking about Romans?
Romans 7 and 8. Okay, sorry. He talks mainly, I see parallels with Ecclesiastes in terms of Paul talking about freeing yourself from the flesh, okay? Freeing yourself in some ways from, even uses the term law, okay? And in terms of flesh, it's sort of interpreted as more kind of carnal knowledges and things like that, but it's meant more than that. Freeing yourself from the thinking that things of this earth and things that sort of please you on this earth are all that it is. And then we go, and I think this is the goodness about the Christian movement. Then in 8, and to some extent 12, he talks Romans 8 and 12. He then talks about the deliverance that is provided through the acceptance of the Son, God, that God has provided us. He's provided us with all of these tools to kind of go beyond what I think Solomon had, which was mere kind of acceptance of things and belief. And in order to free yourself from all of that, you can attain something more. God has given us in 8, he talks about 8 and also 12, kind of renewing the mind, which many people interpret as a sort of born again, but it's more than that. Okay, it's except we have the life of Jesus to emulate, and we also have the Holy Spirit comes in, another tool that God gave us. In other words, I think of those kind of ladder images of these kind of steps that you take, and in that way you're freeing yourself from a kind of bondage. Perhaps that's a terrible summary. I don't know.
No,
but
no.
That's how I interpret it in terms of the scriptures.
No, it's a very good summary. I want to both expand on something you said and also just say a couple of things that people that may be watching this now or may look at it later. So you brought up Ecclesiastes last month or so. We looked at that book because that's a really good book for the meaning of understanding someone. We all struggle with the meaning of life sometimes, and the Orthodox Church accepts that book as being written by Solomon. There's always some discussion in different circles who wrote that book, and as evidence, and why we actually refer to Solomon as a saint, because we see that book as his repentance from all the stuff he did, which was a lot of stuff, right? So
1,000
concubines and all kinds of
idols.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, I mean, not quite in the same.
You had it all.
Not quite in the same area of Egypt category, but in terms of depth of sin, he was pretty close. But but to your point, he didn't take that next step, which is, and we'll get into that a little bit. You also brought up the flesh. So my better Greeks need to help me here, but it's which different from soma. Remember?
Yeah, soma's body.
Body. Is flesh. So he's making a distinction. So like you said, that's the word he was using for the material things in life divorced from the understanding of what they really are spiritually. That's how they become carnal, right? Food and drink are good things, right? Except when you divorce them from their intent, and like me over the holidays, right, had too much, right? I mean, that's when you get into carnality, when it's taking what's intended for good and using it. So that's really what he's talking about. And then the mind, you brought up the mind of Christ, and so that's the phronema. And that's more of, Paul talks a lot about in Romans and other epistles, acquiring the mind of Christ, but it's more than just the mind. It's acquiring, it's that union with Christ, right? That the synergy with Christ, which is where our salvation lies. So, and that's what Solomon, obviously the Old Testament, didn't quite understand or go that next step, but that's more the direction. So so you say where I wanted to take this. I don't necessarily have a place I'm going to take it. I kind of wait to see where we're going, but I have some general points. But one of the things, I think you didn't use the word, but you hit on it. What one bondage is, obviously freedom becomes bondage when we make choices to commit sin. But the thing is, come on in. Hey, Michael. But if someone were to come to you up on the street, hey, you're an Orthodox Christian. How do you guys understand sin? I hear all kinds of stuff. How would you? What is sin? How would you define it or explain it?
Missing the mark.
Okay. Very technical answer.
Very technical.
Absence of God in your actions.
Okay, so be devil. So the person, oh yeah, I heard all that, but what is it? It's all those things are correct.
I mean, it's inherently self-destructive.
Yeah. Think of it, the best way to think of it as a terminal infection. A terminal infection that we do not have the cure for, except through Christ, right? So what does that mean then? How does our bondage become freedom? Well, a couple of different ways, right? If we're giving into the sin in us and doing things that we know blatantly are wrong, right? Missing the mark in that respect, that's one way. But there's also, like the Proverbs say, there's a way that seems right to man. Like there's things because of that, we're not always aware that the choices and what we're doing are actually not good for us, right? I'm sure you deal with some of that, and the people when you're in the medical and the healing professions, mental illness, physical illness, whatever. There's usually things people are doing that aren't in their best interest, but they don't know until they talk to the professionals or don't know it right away. It's kind of like that. So really having an in-depth understanding of sin like that plays into then how we understand freedom and how to attain freedom. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
When you say terminal infection, are you talking about everyone is sinful because of original sin? So it is our nature? What is
No,
terminal
what I mean
infection?
by that is, okay, so going back to the garden we talked about before we went live. Remember what when God said, "Don't eat of the tree, because you shall die death by death," right? Death by death, and that's not in every translation, so it depends. And so the devil, the serpent.
Is it okay?
Yeah, please come in. Nakash was the word that was used in Hebrew, and that word, I don't know if I have a terrible ear, so I pronounce everything wrong. But Hebrew did not have vowels. So that word has like 3 different meanings depending on how you pronounce it. But one of the meanings was an angel-like being with a serpentine quality. That's where we get the reductionist view of the talking snake.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, anyway, so the devil convinced Eve and Adam to say, you're not going to die if you eat of the tree. You're going to become like God. Okay? So that ushered in the conditions. That choice ushered in the conditions of sin, which led to like the pollution, if you will. So so what happened was theologically, the way we understand it is our nature and will, which were one. Our nature still fundamentally remains good. We're creating God's image and likeness, but our will has been damaged. So the terminal condition is we can never make the right choices for ourselves 100% of the time. And we need Christ.
And how do we get to Christ? Is the only path the church and sacraments?
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
I know where God's grace is, but I don't know where it isn't. I know God's grace is in the church, but I can't speak to someone who is of another religion or another faith and act like God and say, oh no, you're going to hell. Do you see what I'm saying? So like, we need to be careful. There's a nuance there. God's grace is in the church. That's what we believe. God is God, though.
God's grace is not elsewhere.
It may be. I don't know.
Well, let's break that down. This isn't this because now we're going to go back to. And surely you remember everything I've ever taught, so I don't have to remind you. So do you remember? Michael, you might not. I don't remember who comes to what class, but we talked November, December. We talked about the scripture. In the beginning was the word, the logos, right? And remember how we defined logos? So that's impactful to us differently than it was back then. Back then, it was a much more impactful, radical thing to say because every religion, every culture understood this concept of logos as being the organizing principle around how the universe, how reality was created, right? So John comes along and says, oh, yes, that's true, but that is incarnate now in the person of Christ, okay? So so when Christ says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, that's the statement of salvation. That doesn't mean, oh, well, whoever doesn't choose me is out. Anything simple like that. What he's saying is, I am the reality. Anything divorced from me is spiritual death that leads to physical death, right? Mm-hmm. So then you get to then the question of grace. So again, let me just say this. First of all, let me stop. Is this, and what I'm saying hanging, is it making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now, how do we as Orthodox Christians understand grace? Because it's important to this dialogue you guys are having. Someone comes up to you on the street. I hear about grace, the unmerited favor of God. Is that right? Is that what you Orthodox Christians think grace is? Obviously not. I wouldn't ask the question. But how would you?
How would we define it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll give you a hint. Well, this St. Gregory Palamas.
The news?
No.
No.
Gregory Palamas actually is keying on something St. Basil said back. Remember the distinction between God's essence and energies?
Yes.
Okay. We can't know God in his essence because we're not God. But God's energies are present
We
in
can
the world.
perceive,
That's
yeah.
how we understand what grace is. So all the goodness that goes on in the world, that's all God's grace. And we're free to participate in it whenever we want.
Yep.
We don't always make the choice to participate in it. So how does it get back then to what you guys were talking about? Everything you said is absolutely true. We understand that because Christ said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And it's not about making all these good choices that get us into heaven. It's about participating in the sacramental life of the church to be healed of this terminal infection. So, and that can't happen outside of the church. But here's to what you said. We also understand and don't understand at the same time God's unfathomable love and mercy.
Mhm.
So we do not understand. And we know the mystery is we know that participating in God's goodness, that God receives those things, right? So we can't say as Orthodox Christians, it's very wrong and bad to say, well, you're not an Orthodox Christian, or you're not a Christian in general. So you're outside of God's love, you're outside of God's mercy, you're outside of God's salvation. We have no idea. But we know what the truth is because that's what we believe in the church. So does that help at all, or does that add confusion?
I may say that it is something that can't explain in words, but to feel. So, grace, Jesus, does not have description, definition, but we feel, and if you are Christian, you trust without any proof, just by heart.
Yeah, your heart. I know what you're saying.
Sounds like the energies you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I wanted to say is, like, you go to the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, and Muslims will pray to St. George, and miracles will happen for them. St. George will intercede on their behalf. Yeah. So, like, these things happen. Many of them do convert. So I've heard stories, So God's grace is not absent from humanity and specific. It's for all humanity. We don't really know, but I will say that salvation is found in the church. That's where we need to be.
Does St. George only produce for Muslims?
No.
Is that-
No, I mean, just yeah.
He's a wise guy.
Yeah.
But no, this is where the paradox and the mystery, this is where it gets a little difficult because, as human beings, rational human beings, we want strict, we want very black and white definitions.
Contracts.
To understand. This is where the paradox, and this is where it gets difficult. So two things are true at once, but what we don't, God's mercy and grace are present everywhere. So again, it just becomes, we can't, and he knows the hearts. That's the problem. Somebody can be doing on the surface, somebody can be doing all these great deeds, but if they're not doing them with and for the heart of Christ, they're not with Christ. And he knows that, right? He knows if you're really secretly, you're doing them because you want praise or you want,
I'll add to that real
Yeah.
quick. I don't remember which saint it was. I was reading him a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that the devil is more virtuous than I am. He has no body. He fasts better.
Oh, yeah.
He's not susceptible to lust. He can be more kind. He can do more miracles. He could, and this is all true. The one thing that he doesn't have though is humility, and he doesn't work with the will of God.
Mm-hmm.
So on those things we can beat him. We can be humble and work within the will of God. That's
our weapon. Our weapon is humility.
Yeah, and working, like you said, participating with Christ. Yeah.
And Michael, per some of the conversations you and I had recently, it's that humility is a lot different than whooping butt. Which I thought was an acceptable solution for a lot of part of my life. So,
Yeah, in the end, God knows the heart. He's the final judge, but he does kind of spoon feed us.
yes.
Stuff. I mean, whether it's the church, the life of Christ, the scriptures, the saints. I mean, it's all sort of there
God-
for you, and that even if you don't follow all of that and you say, oh, it's in your heart you just think it's baloney or I'm just doing this to sort of please somebody, then it sort of does no good. But at the same time, I mean, it's no guarantee, but he constantly reaches out to us and really has provided us with all the necessary things.
Do you remember? So we spent, I don't know, October, September, we spent a lot of time breaking down the parables involving seeds when Christ talked about seeds, right? And you remember the parable of the sower, 3/4 of the seeds were in conditions where they couldn't grow. They couldn't become what they were, supposed to be. So that's important for what we're talking about here, because that's, you're talking about things we do that stun our growth, create conditions where we can't grow. The way we understand salvation is, the concept of synergy, cooperating. We cooperate with God, cooperate with Christ to put ourselves in those conditions to become what we're supposed to be. Because remember in Genesis, it says, the language was, everything was created to become according to its kind. And then Saint Gregory the theologian reminds us that unlike some other theologies, we don't look at, we don't even really technically refer to what happened in Genesis as the fall, because the fall implies Adam and Eve were here and they fell to here. It was Adam and Eve were not supposed to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil yet. They weren't ready for it. We were created with potential, like the seeds, and to realize that potential is that union with God, that communion with God. So broken communion then requires we all respond to how God's reaching out to us to get back into communion with God. And that's where the sacramental life of the church comes in. And so we look at as Adam and Eve veered from the path of potential. And that's where we are all, as human beings, have the potential to become like saints, to become like God. But it's dependent on our choices, but also understanding that there's only one choice, right? It's not Pelagianism or whatever that we can will it by ourselves, right? That makes sense. Because I struggled a lot with this, because I was struggling with how to communicate it clearly and challenging myself to make sure that I even understood it clearly, right?
It's just like we're given guidelines, right? But we can't take them so rigidly.
Yeah.
I think that's where kind of Catholicism kind of factors in. It's a little more legalistic. If you don't do this, then you're bad. You're going to hell. Like it kind of.
Well, legalism in general,
a lot of times.
legalism in general is.
So we have guidelines, but it's like, okay, it's like a kid trying to learn to walk on a balance beam, right? Like you're like, okay, I'm going to take a step. I'm going to fall off probably, right?
Mhm.
You just get back on. You keep trying to keep your balance.
Yeah, no.
Because you're inevitably going to fall, right? It's just going to happen, and that's not a bad thing. Doesn't mean you're a bad person for falling off the balance beam. You just get back on.
Well, just one, and the whole bad person thing is really important, because, and I've said this in here many times, one of the greatest things we have in the church calendar is the fact that we see Saint Mary of Egypt placed on the final Sunday before Holy Week. Yeah. So someone who archetypally is probably the worst type of sinner ever is placed in. It's just to remind us, no one's beyond redemption. Yeah. No fall is so bad. The only way it's bad is if we just decide we're bad and turn away from God and cut ourselves off.
And it doesn't mean there won't be consequences in this.
No, there's always consequences.
Mary of Egypt was in wilderness for 40 years, 30 years. I don't remember the story, but yeah, she was a hermit basically. Like she had a rough life.
Well, part of repentance is not just being remorseful. Yeah. It's the about face, it's the action towards God. But to your point, it's also the mature acceptance of the consequences. Yeah. Because the consequences are what steer you to not. I mean, sometimes the consequences are grave, but they're also the acceptance of that is what keeps you from doing it again. And that's what gets lost a lot. It gets lost a lot today, the messaging of these things, especially in a culture dominated by thoughts and feelings necessarily over actions. It's like, look, you have to accept the consequence, right? That's how. But I want to get into something too. We talked about before we break. Just again this. And let me back up, Vicky. You said about legalism. That's absolutely true, but that's across the board with all Christians. Anytime a Christian adopts a very legalistic mentality, that's where you're almost stunning your growth, because you're not allowing yourself. You're keeping it so defined for yourself so you can manage it. You're not allowing your heart to be open. Orthodox fall into that too. We've all encountered, or maybe we've been this type of person before, rigidity with fasting, or rigidity with different different thoughts. It's not, we can't take the means that we've been given to grow in Christ and make them requirements. That's where there's actually I wrote about it one time at the end of, remember Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean?
Mhm.
Remember at the end of the first movie, because I told you to keep to the code.
Oh, yeah,
and the
yeah,
guy goes,
yeah.
"Oh, we thought of more like guidelines."
Yeah.
That's a great understanding of how we should understand. And one other thing that can help us in understanding is the translation of the word law in the New Testament, where it talks about the law. A better translate of the word Torah, a better translation of that word is the teachings. So if we read the New Testament and substitute the word law with the teachings, it actually helps us embrace more of what Christ was saying, because he's like, you're missing. He said you're missing the whole point, right? You're missing the whole point of what these teachings do. You've turned it into these rigid laws that it's not your growth, but also because you are the teachers, you're stunning other people's growth. But I want to read one more thing, and then we can pick up next week or whatever. So, and John, you made me think of it. So Paul writes too. He says this about Christ, about sin. He said, "For he made him," this capital H. So for the Father made the Son, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So it's not that Christ is actually just dying on our behalf instead of us. He's actually becoming sin to destroy it. Okay. And that's a deeper understanding, because some of this understanding is that's proliferated out there is like, this atonement thinking, which has no place in orthodoxy. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 15:21, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So the idea is that Christ had this self-emptying love, entered into sin for us to destroy it out of love for us. And so getting back to the heart, everything we do in the Christian life needs to be a movement more and more towards this self-emptying love for the other person. Anything done for the gratification of self, that doesn't mean you're not going to feel good when you do good things. God built that into us, right? It means that if that's your motivation, to feel good, as opposed to just that unconditional self-emptying for the other person, that's the path to freedom, the self-emptying love. And that's hard for us to get to, because of the damage to our will, the infection of sin, we're self-involved. And so a lot of our life is that journey to get your mind off yourself, not self-neglect. I'm not talking about that, right? I'm just talking about that where you're not the primary focus, right? And obviously, when you have other people in your life you love, family, children, whatever it may be, that should help you along the way.
Plus, in the real world, if your whole motivation is to move towards self-emptying love, you'll never make CEO.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. But what did Christ say? I've quoted it many times. What is what is esteemed among men is abomination to God. That Greek word, utterly detestable.
I wouldn't say you wouldn't. I'd say that it's harder, because you can't be that Machiavellian cutthroat.
Correct.
You have to consider the other person's emotions and feelings and needs, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I've worked in my business life, because I have a lot of different clients over the years of all shapes and sizes, and I've seen many different leaders, and I've seen some toxic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one, he retired now, this guy, wonderful CEO, called me into his office one day. I was a consultant to his, and he said, I need you to do something, because he goes, I think you can handle it in the right way. I said, okay. He goes, I'm not very confrontational. I'm not this. He went on this like kind of apophatic rant of what he's not. And it was, everything he said was like so counter to what you think of as a CEO. Yet the guy was amazingly successful. And I knew in his office, I was like, oh, I can work with this guy because he wants me to help him. And I have great confidence that I can be honest without him trying to roll heads. And we had this discussion about things, and I talked to my philosophy about like how I understand why companies back in the 70s and 80s moved terminology from personnel departments to human resources, because they wanted to elevate the personnel function in the companies. But what it became was, now we have this rhetoric, human resources, human capital, and it devalues people. They become thought. And so this guy wasn't like that. He was extremely successful. Now he's rare, right? Because, and CEOs have to make decisions, but to your point, that self-emptying love, not everybody's equipped to wield it in positions of power. And I've always thought I probably heard this somewhere, but I've always thought that people that are most equipped to wield power are the ones that don't want it.
Sound like Douglas Adams. Yeah.
Did he say that?
Yeah, he said that sort of a satirical way.
We talked about it in terms of parish council presidency.
Yeah.
The best presidents are the ones that don't want to be
Don't wanna do
president.
it. Yeah.
That must have been the best.
Yeah. Or remember, a person with the initials JC coerced you into it. So there's some holiness behind that. So anyway, all right. So that was a lot. That was a lot of discussion. I hope it was fruitful and useful. And so we'll close there. We'll close in prayer. We'll be back in class next week. I'll have to look at my notes. I don't know if we're going to continue on this or if this has run its course or we're going to go in a different direction. We'll be back January 11th. So God bless everyone. Happy New Year. Christ is born. Glorify him. See you next week.